if you're around just before Wayland kinda stopped sucking, before there were major improvements made during that time that shut the whole world down, you may recall a project by the name of Waycooler. This was an attempt at building a Wayland compositor based on the AwesomeWM model. This is a highly configurable X11 window manager. It has a Lua interface where everything can be configured, and I do mean everything. It's based on DWM, it is incredibly powerful, and if you're the kind of person who wants to really dig into the weeds of what your window manager was doing, this was one of the best options. But alas, AwesomeWM is still only on X11, and due to that, it's kinda probably gonna be lost to the sands of time. There is this open issue, or I guess it's closed now, for supporting Wayland. This was opened up in 2015, and early on there was some hope that this was actually going to happen. But as more time went on, there are a lot of comments, and ultimately, well, the devs were like, unless someone actually goes and does this, it's not gonna happen. And for a time, Waycooler was that someone who was trying to do so. Initially, it wasn't gonna be one-for-one AwesomeWM like how Sway is i3, but it was gonna be close enough, it was very inspired by the model, that a lot of people were getting excited for it. Now, if you go to the repo for Waycooler, it has been marked as archived since 2020. And this is by no means timely, but someone did send me a post-mortem about the project. This was posted back in 2020, and whilst I'm getting to this a little bit late, I do think it's still a fun history lesson. Whilst the project officially died in 2020, there hadn't been any significant progress on it since 2018. So it was kind of in this weird limbo state, there were a bunch of rewrites being done, and it just wasn't gonna happen. So let's see how we got there. Waycooler was started as a college project by the author of this post and Snirk, otherwise known as Snirk. It began as an effort to understand what Wayland was and to experiment with making a better desktop environment. We had used both AwesomeWM, and though I'd switched to i3 by that point, the flexibility of AwesomeWM was something I sometimes missed and was something we wanted to include in our hypothetical desktop environment. Choosing a language and a framework, January to February 2016. The state of Wayland and the state of frameworks was a very, very different landscape back then. Nowadays, you have Wlroots-rs, you have Smithy, you have the Mia project, which is still fairly early on in the Wayland stages, but it's still doing its things. Back then, those didn't exist. Those were not a thing. Mia, I think, would this be before Mia even got dropped? I think this was still when Mia was being developed as a thing for Ubuntu. So at this point, things like Hyprland didn't even remotely exist. I don't think River was around yet because Wlroots wasn't around. Sway, it existed, but it was basically in early alpha stages. If you weren't using one of the desktop environments, Sway was basically the only good option, and it wasn't a good option yet. The original plan was to write it in C, since that seemed to be the prevalent language for compositors. At the time, there was only GNOME, KDE, Western, E, Augment, both of these you probably don't even know about, and an early version of Sway. Instead, though, he was convinced to look into Rust. Snirk was interested in its strong reliability guarantees, his area of research being compiler and language design, its unique approach to memory management drew me in, and after experimenting with the language, we began work on Waycooler. Back in 2016, there were only 3 generic Wayland frameworks: libwestern, SWC, and WLC. Now, libwestern is what Western is built on, and that is still around. Basically, nothing else is built of it besides a couple of industry things, but it does exist. SWC, last update was 2 years ago, and I don't know of any projects that are still built with this that anyone might be using. And then WLC, 7 years ago. A very long time ago, and the last change was by Drew. This is when Sway was actually still being built on WLC. Or I guess technically in the transitionary phase where things were moving over to Wlroots. But in 2016, there was no Wlroots. That didn't exist. Wlroots was made by Drew DeVault, the developer of the original developer of Sway, and at that point, it didn't need to be done because there was WLC. And by the time this blog post came out, this was the only project that was still being based on WLC that was still being developed. There were some issues that come up later, and we'll get to those. We went with WLC for 3 reasons. It was more clear how to wrap the API to be used by Rust, it had a very simple memory model, and a very small API surface. Sway was already using it, and it kicked the tires as it were. It had also proven that it was possible to make a tiling compositor with this framework when there was some doubt such a thing was possible in libwestern. No one else used libwestern, tiling, or otherwise. It was easy to go with a framework that others already relied upon. Because this was going to be a big, long-term project, and they had to wrap the API in Rust, they started out with a short-term goal of converting the approximately 400-line example compositor from C to idiomatic Rust. If they couldn't do that, there was no hope for the project. Setting a short-term goal like this was a great idea, and something I'll continue to do today. Previous attempts at big projects failed because the long-term vision did not pan out before my initial enthusiasm petered out. Setting a short-term goal helped me feel like I accomplished something before the compositor was usable. It made it feel like you're actually making progress, rather than having this big lofty goal, and every day you slightly chip away with it, but you lose sight of what you're trying to do. Even at this very early stage though, there were already some mistakes being made, which weren't clear initially, but in retrospective definitely were. Wrapping a C library to be used in Rust is no small feat, and if we knew what problems we were unintentionally causing for our future selves, we probably would have given up then. The library was very unsound, meaning it was possible to cause memory unsafety from what we erroneously reported was safe Rust code. If we spent more time learning the language and sought help from the wider Rust community in wrapping the library, we would have avoided a lot of headache. Instead, we plunged ahead despite not knowing the language well. Despite rushing into WLC development, we also spent far too much time on it. It took about 2 to 3 months before we had the basic example working in Safe, which again, they didn't even know if it was, as far as we are aware, idiomatic Rust. The API surface is very small. It should not have taken that much time, especially if we had actually sought help. A large part of this is due to having classes at the time. Again, this was during college, so I'm perhaps being too harsh on my past self here. Still, work in the Waycooler repository didn't really begin until April. Now, I would call this another problem. They hadn't even thought of exactly what they wanted this project to be. They knew they wanted it to be inspired by Awesome and have a blend of i3, but when they started the project, they weren't entirely sure. So they went and designed this API, done all this wrapping, and then spent a while trying to work out what they actually wanted to build. For the tiling, I wanted nothing changed, except for the option to use an awesome-based tiling mechanism using Lua. I knew others, Snirk included, who found i3's tiling to be too complicated, giving them the option to use something else, while at the same time having a strong common default seemed reasonable. Snirk had much he wanted to change about the AwesomeWM API. Now, changing this would break any existing configs, would mean that unlike, say, i3, where you could just bring your i3 config to Sway and it basically just works besides the X11 stuff, that wouldn't be the case here. It was inspired by AwesomeWM. It was not a port of AwesomeWM. It had evolved haphazardly over the years, and thus had a few issues. There were constant instability between versions as APIs were deprecated and removed far too quickly. Async versions of functions were added, which led to a split in the ecosystem. 3.x to 4.x was massive. Incompatible jump similar to Python's 2 to 3 jump. Many systems are still stuck on 3.x configurations, and with Awesome, because of how complicated the configuration files are, they aren't a config file format, they are programming in Lua. If you have a big API change, those people can't go to the new version without their entire config breaking. And when the config breaks in Awesome, Awesome doesn't work. you just don't get anything. You get, like, the default config being loaded. Good luck working it out from there. And as I said, it was too complicated. The default rc.lua is 500 lines, and if you had an incorrect line in there, the window manager was essentially unusable. Key functionality should either be moved into the compositor, or the layout of the default configuration should be better annotated, perhaps in multiple files, or layered like in Spacemacs. So even though I like AwesomeWM, my config is actually fairly clean, because I knew that I was going to break something, and something would cause me much pain, so I just didn't find myself wanting to change as much as I could. This is why, a good configuration system, whether it be Hyprland or, I don't know, River, whatever your poison is, makes more sense, unless you want to go, like, all in and have everything be controlled by this, where basically there isn't a window manager. It's you are programming a window manager through an API for building a window manager. BSPWM is a fairly good example of this. You basically have nothing when it first opens. Everything that you do with BSPWM is something that you tell it to go and do. And during this early design phase, we also wanted to allow users to write their code extensions in languages other than Lua. Do you start to see where the problem is happening with this project, where they didn't exactly have a clear vision, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Initially, it was going to be like AwesomeWM, and then very quickly, it just expands into this complicated mess that can be done, but with 2 people that are working on it part-time during college, it just probably wasn't going to happen. We added dbus support that mirrors the Lua functionality to accommodate this. A colleague of ours had interest in writing a status bar for Waycooler, but he wanted to write it in Node.js. Is there a single status bar written in JavaScript? I'm sure there is, but I don't know of one because it's not any of the popular ones. But since it was just the 2 of them, if it ended up being written, he agreed to ship it. These 2 features were included in the initial announcement we made in 2017. These were our first major design mistakes. And the problem is he wasn't really looking at the project as an open source project that he wanted to use. It was being treated more as a product, and that's not inherently a bad thing, right? Like, there are projects that are doing this well. Take Graphite, for example. But Graphite has a clear vision of what they're trying to do. They have everything roadmapped out, they have design documents, they have everything you need to actually run a project in a corporate-y kind of way. This is 2 guys in college who are kinda LARPing as a business, but they're not going all the way, so it ends up just becoming this complicated web of nonsense that nobody has control over. And instead of trying to build something good, it began chasing popularity. I made major concessions because growing the project was my main objective. Maintaining a dbus bridge just so users don't have to write Lua is a waste of development effort. A status bar written in Node.js is an objectively terrible idea and was most widespread criticism once the project was announced. Ultimately, the dbus bindings were left to languish, and the Node.js bar was swiftly cancelled. While I ultimately chose Rust because it was a good fit at the start, this was also seen as hip technology I was using. The mindset would continue to dominate my thought process up until a few months ago. Oddly enough, this was the hardest thing to accept. Despite how obviously misguided the exercise was, at the start I was simply delighted in making something and then using it. That act of creating something that I could then use was extremely delightful. After that faded, however, I chased after being popular. There was real delight in seeing the GitHub star count and download numbers tick up. Seeing the first post of Waycooler in r/unixporn felt like a real triumph, despite how poorly designed the whole thing was. Mistakes with Unsafe Rust, summer 2016. Initially, since we were working on disjoint parts of the codebase, we didn't really review each other's code. This was both of our faults. We were essentially blind to what the other was doing. We were unable to effectively determine if the other's design made sense since we lacked context. Our reviews thus consisted of surface-level flaws, e.g. style and idiomatic Rust usage. While useful, we were worse off for not understanding what the other was doing. Effectively, they were creating two separate projects in the same codebase. He expressed later that he felt cut off from what I was doing since it was so hard to read and understand my code. Having worked with him on other projects in other languages, I don't think this is due to a language choice. Code written by others is hard to read, and by this point, we were still very inexperienced. We could write code, but reading code is an oft-neglected skill for an early self-taught programmer. Both of them. And being 2016, this was still very early days of Rust, so they went through 3 designs of a tree in Rust. This is a basic data structure, because Rust at the time, I don't know now, does not provide one beyond a binary search tree. Because of the borrow checker, this is a much harder problem than it is in other languages. This is a hidden cost of Rust. It makes certain patterns that are common in most other common languages nearly impossible because of the lack of a garbage collector coupled with its safety guarantees. The first attempt was more or less what every Rust newbie does when they need to make a tree that needs immutable pointers to its parent. This led to a mess. Basically a mess. This is basically unusable type soup. And thanks to my debug code, I was able to quickly catch that when I switched from workspaces 1 through 5, it would segfault after going to workspace 5. At first, I thought this was a bug in WLC. After all, we'd gotten a few already from other misuses of the API, so it seemed reasonable. Once I enabled my debug code though, I realized it would crash much earlier. The entire tree was screwed up after switching to the 5th workspace every time. I was still new to debugging memory issues, but I was more experienced than Snirk, so I tackled it with the amount of unearned confidence that only someone who has no idea what they're doing can feel. Very much convinced that he understood more than he did, and problems happened because of that. It became clear that our tree was not sound once I consulted the rules of Unsafe more. Because we used a vector, it would allocate 4 spaces for some reason default, and when the 5th workspace was allocated, all of our parent pointers would become dangling. This was a valuable, if late and painful, lesson on how Rust's unsafe keyword actually works. And being so inexperienced with the language, really the only thing that could have been done here is reached out to more experienced Rust developers, go to the Rust subreddit, ask people, hey, does this code make sense? Am I a moron? Am I doing something that's going to break? Is it going to work and then explode later on? Can somebody just review my code? This is the problem you have when you're 1, an inexperienced developer, and then 2, inexperienced developing in a new model. You need someone, unless you're willing to first work on smaller projects or make a project that kind of just sucks initially, you need to have someone around that can, like, explain why you're stupid. The first release, August 2016. On Friday, August 12th, 2016, Snirk and I cut the 0.3 release, which is a weird number for first release, and officially announced Waycooler to the Linux and Rust communities. We posted at r/Rust, r/Linux, r/programming, and Hacker News. The post did really well, and we were happy to answer all the questions. We didn't have a website at the time. Instead, we spruced up the README with a video demonstration. At the end of the day, I happened to check our star count and was floored to see it was almost at 400 stars on the first day. We didn't expect the level of attention it got, especially in the very welcoming Rust community. The Get a chat that was set up for the project was suddenly active with potential users. We were quick to explain plans, with a few people promising to contribute patches. Few did, the most significant patch being much later fixing server-side borders for tabbed and stacked containers. It was a good idea to have something ready. That has been the mistake of projects in the past. The issue is, whilst there was a project, there was a serious problem that caused it to die on people's machines. There were things that were not working, that should have been working, that seemed to be working, and this didn't really show until real users started using it. And once you have a bad first impression, fixing that is incredibly difficult. You need to have a No Man's Sky level change, a Cyberpunk level change, where you completely reinvigorate what you are doing, completely change it. Otherwise, you're never going to sort of break that mentality. And from here, things only kinda got worse. So, October 2016, the other main developer, Snirk, left the project. I can only speculate to his decreased interest, but there are 3 main factors I think led to me talking to him about stepping down from the project. First, he wasn't actually using Waycooler. This made it less delightful to add new features. In order to use Waycooler, he would need to add his own tiling, and a significant portion of his existing functionality he enjoys in AwesomeWM. Even just a subset of that functionality, like my initial i3 features, would take considerable effort. Second, he was focusing more on school at the time, which is totally reasonable, and this is probably the main reason. His grades were suffering in the previous semester, the authors are suffering, and the author was less concerned about that than Snirk was. Third, I was overbearingly obsessed with the growth of the project. After the amazing response, I spent hundreds of hours over 3 years trying to grow the project. Because I treated it like a product, I set up expectations from him like he was a fellow employee, not the volunteer that he actually was. This ultimately pushed him away as I was demanding too much out of his time. i3 compatibility and doubts on next features. By the end of 2017 and the release of 0.7.0, I had implemented all the features I needed to feel comfortable in Waycooler. The i3 tiling was even better than Sway. Again, this was a project that was supposed to be doing the whole awesome thing, so it's cool that that's great. But the project that had just completely forgotten what it was going to be. And the features that were based on AwesomeWM, specifically the parts that were scriptable, were considerably lacking, however. You could change the colors of the borders around windows, change key bindings, and specify programs to run on startup, but these are all features that could be done better with a static configuration. Waycooler was achieving it through an embedded Turing-complete language that was more or less going to waste. During the last half of 2017, I thought about where the project should go and came to the conclusion that Waycooler wasn't solving any real problems that others had. It was half solving both i3 and awesome niches, and if it had done both of those well, I think it would be a really cool project. The problem, at this stage it wasn't. So then, pivoting to AwesomeWM clone, the thing that it kind of already was supposed to be from the start, I decided to pivot the project to fit what I perceived was a gap in the market, a full Wayland AwesomeWM clone, because it's technically possible to have i3 tile on AwesomeWM, you just need to implement it yourself in Lua. I decided I could still use Waycooler if it was an AwesomeWM clone. I reached out to the Awesome maintainers, and it seemed like a good idea, so I started profiling exactly what needed to be done. I went through a few false starts. I'd switched to rLua by this point, which is a very high-level library for Lua. It didn't allow me to do certain unsafe operations that AwesomeWM was doing in their Lua code that I would need for full compatibility. At first, I tried to just bind the Lua libraries myself, but there was so much unsafe code that had to be written that instead I decided to fix the pain points in rLua itself. I submitted a few patches and issues that let me do various things, namely around user data, including the Lua debug library. I essentially started Waycooler over from scratch, trying to build one massive binary that would be both a compositor and a Lua interpreter. Then comes Wlroots and Wlroots-rs. By 2017, WLC, the library they were using, was basically a mess. Sway was sick of it, everyone was sick of it, it wasn't going anywhere, it didn't seem to have any idea what it wanted to be, and something better needed to be done. This is what led to the creation of the Wlroots library. And Waycooler decided to go with Wlroots, but again, they wanted to do things in Rust. And that meant you had to do something about that. So, because of this, they had to go and work on Wlroots-rs. So, this is another project where the thing they're building is getting completely sidelined to work on wrapping another library in Rust. I would spend most of 2017 and 2018 trying to make this library safe. Come 2018, splitting up the binaries. In 2018, while I was working on rewriting Waycooler to use Wlroots-rs and be AwesomeWM compatible, I ran into a bug once it got timers working. If I restarted by throwing away the old Lua context and making a new one, it would trigger a segfault. This was not a bug in Rlua, but rather in glib. This library is used by AwesomeWM to implement timers. The library would keep pointers to the old Lua context because it was designed to trigger some arbitrary code after some time, and in this case, the arbitrary code was Lua code. All of this was by design. The way AwesomeWM handled this was a restart. In AwesomeWM, just re-exec the binary. This was possible in X11 because a window manager is just a client. This isn't feasible in Wayland because a compositor is the server, and so to re-exec Waycooler would cause all clients to be disconnected. This is a terrible user experience, so I had to redesign the project again. This is something that pretty much every Wayland project that people use have actually solved by now, but at the time was a far less discussed topic. And once again, this led to re-architecting the project. All of this is happening basically because the person who was writing it was learning things as they were going. They didn't have a clear vision and how to do it. They kind of were just like piecing things together here and there. And when things broke, well, you don't know how far down the stack you're gonna have to rebuild. And this leads to rebuilds on rebuilds on rebuilds. Any project is gonna have this. But you want to make sure you have your core vision, your core framework laid out, and hopefully that is solid. Hibernation excuse. By 2018, my motivation for the project was at an all-time low. Wlroots-rs was causing an unnecessary amount of stress. I was obsessed with making sure it was 100% safe, which required thinking of every major edge case possible. I would constantly have days where I'd find a safety hole in my design, and I'd have to rip out everything and start basically from scratch. All the safety code I added made it nearly unusable, so I had to make obtuse, awkward macros and later proc macros in an attempt to keep the library ergonomic. There was roughly zero work done on Waycooler during this year. All of my efforts went into Wlroots-rs. And then he had some internships at Microsoft in the summer and Google in the autumn. And these are really cool internships. Like, congratulations for doing that. The problem is the Google internship disallowed working on these side projects unless you're willing to let Google own the project. Yeah, so basically the project couldn't be continued. And in April of 2019, I officially gave up on Wlroots-rs. It was far too much work to maintain, was stressing me out every day, and I was able to quickly rewrite the compositor portion of Waycooler in C that it seemed silly I wasted so much time wrapping so little of the API. I knew this would have mixed reception, since I was essentially rewriting at least part of my project that was originally going to be in Rust into C. I gave my justification well enough in that post, I think. Then there was a bit of renewed interest as he switched back to C, because now he can actually work on the project instead of working on a Rust binding for the library to build the project. And then, as a last-ditch effort, I decided to see how quickly I could hack the AwesomeWM binary to work under the mostly working Waycooler compositor written in C. To my surprise, I deleted 15 lines of code, and I had something that was working better than the Rust version I had been writing for a year or so at this point. I decided to switch tracks, instead forking AwesomeWM and building Wayland support into it that way. And this was actually somewhat functional. It wasn't perfect, and it will crash the moment it tries to execute any X11 code, but it surprisingly worked, and it was in a much better state than what happened over the last 3 years. And then finally cutting ties, January 2020. I made some strides with this new version of Waycooler, even going so far as being able to dogfood it. Ultimately, there are a few things that finally got me to become so bored with the work that I couldn't continue. The first most obvious is I don't actually like AwesomeWM, and that is the biggest motivator. If you like i3 more, you were never going to be dedicated to doing this, right? The reason why so many projects actually work is the people building them wanted them to actually happen. Second issue is that AwesomeWM is heavily tied to the X11 model. Trying to make a clone of Wayland led to basically recreating X11. The point of Wayland is to move away from the X11 model, not to recreate it. I really enjoyed working on this project, even though 2017 was the heyday. It always felt so great to work on something that could be self-hosted, e.g. I could write Waycooler code in Waycooler. and was something that I was designing for myself first. Well, at least until it became AwesomeWM, and then you don't like awesome. It taught me Rust, which I currently use every day in my day job, how Wayland works, how the Linux graphics pipeline works, how to deal with user requests, how to review patches, how to market a project, and now it's teaching me how to walk away from a big awful thing you created and to let it go, even if you don't want to. And whilst this project didn't have a good ending, I do think this is a good lesson on how not to manage a project, how to understand what it is you're trying to build and sort of interact with the open source space and interact with the language you're building and know from the start that you have an actual vision and not kind of piece it together along the way. This wasn't a successful project, but I think it's a project we can all learn from. So, on that note, I am happy we're in an era now where there are really good Wayland compositors being made, because when this was going on, there just wasn't anything great. If you didn't want to use the desktop environment, you kind of didn't have an option. Now you do, but sadly, things like Waycooler just aren't a thing anymore. And I hope someone comes along and does something like it again, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really liked the video, go subscribe. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and that was pretty cool.